I'm really worried about a faction of my audience. And quite frankly, I'm really worried about the left. And this is not concern trolling. I'm worried because of the response to a video that I did yesterday explaining some unfortunate realities about Medicare for all.
A while back, professional gamer Ninja tweeted, "I'll never understand how college and NFL football teams allow kickers that just miss kicks. I feel like there has to be pools of kickers in the USA that won't miss simple kicks, or snappers that won't mess the snaps. I don't know, man, it seems so silly. Would love opinions on this." I'm not a gamer, but this was not the first I had heard of Ninja. Ironically enough, the first time I saw him was in an NFL commercial. Apparently, he is best known for playing Fortnite. So, a fellow pro gamer replied in the form of parody, trying to relate kicking to something that Ninja was actually familiar with. "I'll never understand how pro Fortnite players just miss shots. I feel like there has to be pools of pro players who can just click on their heads and hit every shot with 100% accuracy. Just seems so silly." To which Ninja replied, "This is the reply ever. Fortnite requires movement, editing, building, rotating, and hitting shots. There are not positions in Fortnite. A kicker's job is literally to kick." Horrible analogy, kind of embarrassing. The only one who should be embarrassed by this is Ninja. There's a reason why professional kickers get paid millions of dollars to do what they do. There is a ton riding on them doing their job right. Championships have been won and lost due to kicking, and franchises and players have missed out on millions of dollars in merchandise sales, endorsements, and revenue thanks to missed kicks. If it was possible to be an automatic kicker, who could perform under any level of pressure and under any weather conditions, teams would have found them and rewarded them handsomely. Instead, you have a number of teams that have a permanent liability at that position. Just ask the Chicago Bears. I'm not here to talk about football or gaming though. I want to talk to you about the Dunning-Kruger Effect. According to Wikipedia, the Dunning-Kruger Effect is a cognitive bias in which people assess their cognitive ability as greater than it is. It is related to the cognitive bias of illusory superiority and comes from the inability of people to recognize their lack of ability. Without the self-awareness of metacognition, people cannot objectively evaluate their competence or incompetence. As described by social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, the cognitive bias of illusory superiority results from an internal illusion in people of low ability and from an external misperception in people of high ability. That is, the miscalibration of the incompetent stems from an error about the self, whereas the miscalibration of the highly competent stems from an error about others. What we saw from Ninja was a version of the Dunning-Kruger effect. He thinks that kicking is easier than it is because, as far as I know, he's never done it. But he understands the difficulties of his own trade because that's what he's an expert in. We see this sort of thing a lot here on YouTube. A lot of people who watch YouTube seem to think that it's pretty easy to make videos. Granted, it's not the hardest thing in the world, but it's more difficult than most would guess. I certainly didn't appreciate how much there was to it until I started doing it myself. Naturally, some of this problem is due to the fact that being good at YouTube means you make it look easy. Of course, if it were easy to build a successful channel and make money off of it, then everyone would do it. As a small channel, I generally don't catch flack like this, but every big YouTuber seems to get this criticism from time to time, and most of them just take it in stride. In the progressive news sphere, our friends over at TYT are frequently on the receiving end of this, both in terms of their stylistic performance and in their actual analysis. Cenk, Anna, and everyone else on the Young Turks are actually in poor standing with many online lefties. One of the most common criticisms I see of them from the left is that they're sellouts. All of that money they got from that venture capital investment not only bought them fancy production values, it also bought their integrity. Or so the critics say. Anna Kasparian is not deaf to these criticisms.
While you talk about me being a motherfucking corporate shill, right, with my tiny team and limited resources to do a 2-hour show every single day, and on top of that, a weekly heavily produced scripted show for No Filter, come do my job, come do it, well, right? And I'm not trying to say that I'm some superhero, right? Mm-hmm. But what I'm trying to say is, for all the people out there who think, oh, I could do that better, then let's see you do it. Let's see you do it. And if you can't do it here, because Cenk will say, no, you're crazy, what are you thinking about? You could do it on YouTube. You could do it anywhere else. Do it better. Do it better. I want to see it.
I have absolutely no doubt that Anna's job is difficult, and she understands the extent to which her company is struggling far greater than her critics do. But I can't help but laugh. There's the obvious irony here. The network that goes around calling other media outlets corrupt sellouts doesn't like tasting their own medicine. But there's another, more subtle level of irony here. The Young Turks, as well as so many other online progressives, are convinced that politicians are sellouts because they don't get the results that the American people supposedly want. As I've said in a previous video, most progressives don't believe in trade-offs, political or practical. This leaves little room for disagreement. For example, they think that adopting single-payer healthcare will result in better services for everyone, it will cost less, and it won't be remotely disruptive. They think it's an obvious political winner as well. Since it's such an obvious solution with no real trade-offs, only bad actors who are bought off would oppose it.
We know what the right policy is, but, and last thing, Democrats, you go Medicare for all. It's a no-brainer, and it's supposed to be a progressive position. The overwhelming majority of Democrats are still like, oh, that's impractical. That's a Republican talking point. Why are you saying that? It's because you're corrupt. You take donor money. Anyone who's not for Medicare for all, who's a Democrat, flat out corrupt, period. Period.
This was actually one of the reasons that Cenk Uygur decided to run for Congress. He wants to prove that running as an uncorrupted progressive can get you elected in a purple district. Once elected, how will Cenk help implement the progressive agenda? Well, he's going to fight. Credit to my buddy Sean from the channel Actual Justice Warrior for putting together this compilation.
I will not be a standard politician. I will fight for them. I'm gonna fight to get money out of politics. If you wanna fight, and if you want a real fighter, to fight for women's rights on every issue. But what's the size of the fight in you? Because look, I'm gonna fight like hell, and I think I'm gonna win this race. This is the day to fight more than any other day. You say to people on that day, don't fight today. And when no one is paying attention anymore, that's when you're supposed to fight? No, you get in the fight right now. Don't get in the fight then. People believe in sending a fighter to Washington. What you need is fighters. Every day I wanna fight for you.
So, Cenk is gonna fight. Wow, what a great idea. It's a shame that no one else had ever thought to do that. To his credit, Cenk is not quite that myopic. He and his fellow TYT hosts know that the Democrats choose not to fight because they're paid by the donor class not to.
The donors pay for the really strong Republicans who push the political spectrum to the right and really weak, compliant Democrats who go, oh, the Republicans are so right.
Again, this is their explanation for why we don't have single-payer healthcare. And there is some truth in it. It's certainly the case that entrenched interests are fighting against it. They always do and they always will in some form or another, regardless of what structural reforms you put in place. The truth is, and I know this will come as a shock to some of you, it's actually hard to implement sweeping changes in a country as large as the United States. Getting the representatives of hundreds of millions of people on the same page is like herding cats. Weirdly enough, Cenk actually reminds me a bit of Ted Cruz after he first got elected. Some of you may remember that the 2013 government shutdown was actually brought about by Cruz in an attempt to repeal Obamacare. Cruz insisted that Obamacare could be repealed, despite the fact that Republicans did not have enough votes to override President Obama's veto. So how would they do it? Well, all they had to do was fight.
We have a fight we can win. If Obamacare isn't working, this is our single best opportunity to defund it in the next 63 days.
The president will veto it. I mean,
if 41 Republicans stand together in the Senate, or if 218 Republicans stand together in the House, we can win this fight. If it depends upon politicians in Washington, it ain't gonna happen. The only way this is gonna happen is if an army of grassroots Americans stand up. It's why this week was a national website was launched, don'tfundit.com, don'tfundit.com, because if we see thousands or millions of Americans calling their senators, calling their elected representatives saying, don't fund this train wreck that is killing jobs and hurting our health care, that's the only way to get the elected representatives to listen to the people.
Obamacare was very unpopular at the time, after all. So Ted Cruz got his fight, the government shut down, and Obamacare remained in place. The Republicans couldn't even repeal the bill when they had the presidency. Turns out, it's hard to get things done in Washington. In fact, healthcare reform is famously hard. This was true well before the Obamacare fight, even back in the good old days that progressives pined for. Almost every president since World War II has tried and failed to come up with comprehensive healthcare reform. FDR actually did very little to advance the cause, but Harry Truman took up the fight after Roosevelt died. In 1946, he proposed a universal health insurance program. His opponents, including the American Medical Association, decried it as socialized medicine, and the bill eventually died in Congress. The Eisenhower administration passed the 1956 Military Medicare program that paid for the healthcare services of military dependents. His administration also supported the Four-Hand Bill, which would provide health insurance for Social Security beneficiaries. Despite support from the White House, as well as from the AFL-CIO, the largest union in the country at the time, the bill died in Congress. The Kennedy administration supported the King-Anderson bill, where healthcare would be extended to those 65 and older as part of the Social Security program. Facing resistance from special interests, Kennedy decided that he would take his case directly to the people. On May 20th, 1962, 33 public rallies were held in different American cities, including one at Madison Square Garden that the president attended personally. During the rally, he gave a televised speech.
The fact of the matter is that what we are now talking about doing, most of the countries of Europe did years ago.
Despite his best efforts, the bill died in Congress. President Johnson, who took office after Kennedy's assassination, won a landslide victory in 1964, where he had a huge majority in the House and a supermajority in the Senate. Johnson was the former majority leader of the Senate and was a famously cunning politician. He was able to pass Medicare and Medicaid as part of his Great Society agenda, though it should be noted that he ultimately passed these at the expense of single-payer. According to the Harvard Political Review, a full single-payer program could have faced lethal opposition from constituents and moderates in Congress. Putting their political strength toward incremental progress ensured successful reform for the Democrats. In 1971, Richard Nixon championed the National Health Insurance Standard Act. The NHISA would have looked an awful lot like Obamacare by providing national insurance through employers with certain employees eligible for government subsidies. The NHISA failed to pass, but the Nixon administration was able to pass the Health Maintenance Organization Act of 1973, which encouraged the creation of HMOs. Jimmy Carter had campaigned on national health insurance and went to work on it once elected, aided by a 60-seat supermajority in the Senate. President Carter's reform never got much traction, and the economy went into a deep recession soon after Carter took office, shifting the focus to economic issues. Bill Clinton was the next Democrat to be elected and immediately tried to take up healthcare reform. He assembled a task force, headed by his wife Hillary Clinton, which drafted the American Health Security Act of 1993, which required a minimum health care plan for all citizens, in which employers covered 80% of premiums. The bill was dubbed Hillary Care and ultimately died in committee. The next time a healthcare overhaul was pursued in a serious way was during the Obama administration. After failing several times, both the House and the Senate were able to pass separate versions of the ACA. When the bill entered the reconciliation process, the Democrats lost their 60-seat majority in the Senate because of a special election in Massachusetts, the state that had the very healthcare system they were seeking to emulate. Scott Brown won in an upset victory for Republicans and campaigned specifically on voting against the president's healthcare initiative. He specifically said that he would be the 41st Republican senator, finally allowing the GOP to filibuster Obamacare. When it seemed like all hope was lost, Nancy Pelosi was able to convince her caucus to pass the Senate's bill in March of 2010. I'm not a fan of Obama nor Obamacare, but given the difficulty in reforming our healthcare system, Joe Biden was absolutely right when he said this. So why is changing our healthcare system so difficult? Well, according to Paul Starr, a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton, who worked on healthcare reform in the Clinton administration, and who is an advocate for single payer, things became particularly difficult after the passage of Medicare. As he writes in his book Remedy and Reform, when America finally adopted critical tax and health financing policies in the 2 decades after World War II, it ensnared itself in a policy trap, devising an increasingly costly and complicated system that has satisfied enough of the public and so enriched the healthcare industry as to make change extraordinarily difficult. In other words, yes, you do have big players like the pharmaceutical and insurance industries that have stake in the current system, but they're not the only ones. Most of the public likes their current healthcare situation and is particularly sensitive to change. According to a 2018 Gallup poll, about 69% of Americans rate their healthcare coverage as excellent or good, and 80% rate their quality of healthcare as excellent or good. This despite the fact that most Americans have a poor view of the system overall. There are significant problems with the status quo, such as the number of people left uncovered. But the fact that the current stakeholders in our system are relatively satisfied makes change extremely difficult to achieve. You may remember that a major part of Obama's pitch during the battle for the ACA was that those who are currently satisfied with their situation would not be disrupted.
If you've got health insurance, you like your doctor, you like your plan, you can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan.
Failure to deliver on this promise cost him a great deal politically. People may say in the abstract that they want something different, but when it comes down to how they actually vote, they're much more likely to stick with what they have over the promises of something better. I should also note that when we talk about entrenched interests, such as big pharma or insurance companies, we're not just talking about the evil, greedy CEOs and shareholders who run these companies. The rank and file that work at these companies have stake in the current system as well. They actually asked Bernie about this in the most recent Democratic debates, and a lot of people on the left scoffed.
This article also goes on to criticize how the centrist framing of pretty much every question that was posed to these candidates.
How could you not?
Who will stand up for Insurance Town in the 2020 election?
Yeah, that was one of the most ridiculous questions he got asked.
Try to put yourself in the shoes of one of these people, though. Would you rather lose your job in exchange for promises from a politician of something better, or stick with what you have now? Most would choose the latter. Thus far, I've only discussed competing interests as a roadblock to reform. I haven't even touched on party politics. Fortunately, David Pakman has already done that. David is in favor of Medicare for all, but he actually has sober views about the political realities of achieving it.
Even if Democrats take the Senate in 2020, which would be by the slimmest of margins, as I've outlined for you before, it's not going to be enough to pass Medicare for all. Because number one, even if Democrats do take the Senate by a few seats in 2020, you need 60 votes in order to pass something like Medicare for all, which Democrats are not going to have after this upcoming election. And not all Democrats even support Medicare for all in the Senate. You can then look at 2022, but then if you're only starting the conversation, then again, you still need 60 votes in the Senate to pass this. It's a question mark whether Democrats could even get a 60 vote majority in 2022. And then imagine that you solve that problem. You have some bigger issues to deal with. We have a conservative Supreme Court. We are going to have a conservative Supreme Court for some time. Why does that matter? When we talk about Medicare for all, two different reasons. Number one, if you don't make private insurance illegal, as some want to do, it significantly hurts the financial viability of Medicare for all. Making private insurance illegal would be almost impossible under the current Supreme Court or any Supreme Court that's like it. It will be fought endlessly by moneyed interests up to the Supreme Court. This is not a Supreme Court that will say private insurance is now illegal. It's just not going to happen. And that is something that will hurt the financial viability of Medicare for all and realistically will make it not happen politically.
How did his audience take this? Well, the ratio on the video is pretty brutal. 2.1k likes to 1.8k dislikes. Highly unusual for a popular channel like David's. Also, after this video, a number of people in the progressive sphere predictably denounced him as a sellout. To bring this video back to the beginning, this is a consequence of thinking things are easy when they're not. Most online progressives have bought the premise that politics is completely simple.
Politics is an easy game that we make difficult. All those overpaid Democratic strategists in Washington, D.C., they're useless. So we have the answers. Now it's just time to implement them and fight for them and be unapologetic on that front. And if you do that, the Republicans will be in a permanent minority from now until the end of time.
When problems are simple, so are the solutions. This is why people like Cenk Uygur think that fighting is all we're lacking. If only the right people said the right combination of words in front of the right audience, the progressive agenda would be realized. They think that something is easy because they operate on the outside and they don't actually know what they're talking about. Consider what Kyle Kulinski said in response to David Pakman.
So if Bernie Sanders is in the White House, then what? Bernie Sanders goes and gives a national address on TV, and he says, from the Oval Office, my friends, we are faced with an obstructionist Congress that's bought off by the for-profit health insurance companies and by Big Pharma. We're going to fight that, and we're going to end that. What I need is everybody to go march on Washington now. I want to see millions of people in Washington. I want to see, camps set up, tents set up. I want people to park there and say, we are not leaving until we get Medicare for all implemented, until Congress passes, the House of Representatives passes Medicare for all, the Senate passes Medicare for all, and I sign the Medicare for all bill. And I, as president, am co-signing you to take names of everybody who's against Medicare for all, write it down in stone, and we're going to primary them in the next election, and we're going to win. So we're going to do a general strike. We're going to march on Washington. We're going to primary everybody who's against Medicare for all, and we're going to win. And you know what happens then, Sahil? Same thing that happened in history previously with these big battles. If you keep fighting, you make them bend to your will, and you can absolutely win.
Online progressives genuinely believe that the president just needs to make some heroic speeches and hold some rallies, and the intransigent politicians will bend to their will. All I hear about from Kyle is how broke and desperate Americans are. But he honestly thinks that if Bernie called for a general strike, millions of people would put everything down and go to Washington to protest so that they could have government-run healthcare. I seriously doubt it would work. I know I wouldn't show up. Now let's revisit Obamacare real quick, before I wrap this video up.
Obama gave away the farm in that negotiation. It's true. It is what it is. He went from, saying, hey, if we started from scratch, single-payer Medicare for all is the way to go. And then he caved to, well, let's fight for a public option. And then it took like 2.5 minutes for him to be like, okay, let's do Mitt Romney's idea. Let's do that. Let's do an individual mandate system.
It's definitely true that Obamacare was a compromise. It's also true that they barely got it passed, even with 60 Democrats in the Senate. Are we supposed to believe that if only he had fought harder, he could have gotten a more progressive bill? Well, that's probably not true. One of the holdouts in the Senate was Joe Lieberman, who was not even a Democrat at the time. It's hard to believe that he would have gone further left, given that he wouldn't even budge on the relatively modest proposal of a Medicare buy-in for those 55 and older. It's also hard to believe that he would have responded differently if they had held some rallies, or if Obama had made some speeches against him, given that he wasn't planning on running for re-election. The other two holdouts were Ben Nelson of Nebraska and Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. Nelson, like Lieberman, wasn't seeking re-election, so presumably he wouldn't have been afraid of public pressure. So how did the Democrats get these last two votes? Well, they bought them. The Democrats agreed to pay for the entirety of the Medicaid expansion in their respective states with federal funds. These deals were derisively called the Cornhusker Kickback and the Louisiana Purchase. But that's the ugly reality of politics. So much of it comes down to deal-making just like that. There's a reason that politics is compared to sausage making. Yes, effective presidents that progressives admire like FDR and LBJ used the bully pulpit to their advantage, but they were also famously shrewd when it came to deal-making. That's the only proven way to balance different interests and legislate in America. Ironically enough, the people who are most in favor of government action are the ones who have the least stomach for it. Balancing competing interests through deal-making is hard, and it does not lend itself well to sweeping change, but it's the only proven way of getting things done. Maybe things have changed so much in the last 10 years as to make this model of governing obsolete, but I doubt it. If there was an easier way to do things, someone would have done it.